A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you, the Monday edition of 2020. Shortly, we will open our talkback lines, and you might like to ask a question or make a comment about the topic that we'll talk about today. We're going to be talking about the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia. Well, since the October 7th atrocity where Hamas terrorists launched an attack on Israel, taking more than 1,200 lives and triggering war, there's been a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism here in Australia. Some attention today on a string of anti-Jewish sermons delivered in Australian mosques by Muslim preachers. These have attracted much critical attention in the Australian media. And for so many, actions by our politicians and our law enforcement authorities to contain Islamic incitement has been found wanting. New South Wales Police, after conducting their own investigations in Sydney, declared that they have no grounds to take legal action against anti-Semitic preachers. The Jewish community was shocked and distressed by this, and they've reportedly explored their own possibilities of taking their own legal action. So, are these political views new to Australia? Is the rise of anti-Semitism new to Aussies? And what might we expect from intervention in organisations like the Australian Human Rights Commission? Well, our special guest today says the relevant authorities have been found missing in action. Dr. Mark Durie is our guest through this coming hour. He's founding director of the Institute for Spiritual Awareness, and he's Senior Research Fellow at the Melbourne School of Theology. He's a Christian expert in Islam. Mark Durie, a special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you again, Neil.
Mark, let's start with these preaching messages and preachers, because since the October 7th atrocity, there's been a string of anti-Jewish sermons that have been delivered in Sydney mosques by Muslim preachers. What's your take on what's been happening?
Yeah, I think the need among the Muslim community for rising to stir up support for Hamas and the Palestinian cause at this time has triggered these sermons. And what's happened is a number of preachers have rehearsed some anti-Semitic ideas which are actually go back to the Quran and to the life of Muhammad, and they've brought them to the fore and promoted what can only be called religious hatred against Jews through their sermons. And this began back in October, November. There were a whole series of these sermons, and it's been continuing into this year as well.
Is there freedom of speech in Australia that enables preachers in certain messages to call for the annihilation of a race of people? Is this something that exists here in Australia?
Yes, I think the sermons don't necessarily call for the annihilation of a race, but they do express quite extreme hatred. For example, they attribute despicable motives to Jews. They say that they're treacherous, that they love violence. These are all ideas that come from the Quran. I think one preacher even said, if the Muslims all spat on the Jews, they'd drown. So very, very contemptuous statements. The problem is New South Wales has an anti-incitement law. And the way there's the civil provisions, as they're called, and someone who is incited against needs to make a complaint for those provisions to work. So the Jewish community would need to initiate a process in order to take action. So those civil provisions are one issue. And definitely I think this is a matter of inciting hatred, and they should. But the problem is that the preachers are preaching hatred in the context of commending violence. And so it's quite intimidating to take a case like that to the tribunal. New South Wales also has criminal provisions which only the police and the Director of Public Prosecutions can initiate. And the problem with those is that those provisions really apply when someone incites someone to a specific or a particular act of violence. So making general theological statements like, if you don't rule by Sharia law, you don't deserve to live, or, at the end times, Allah will cause the Jews to be killed. Statements like this are not direct incitement to violence. They're not saying, go and attack a Jew, So the police, I think, decided based on their review of the sermons and the law that they didn't have a law that would allow them to deal with these anti-Semitic, anti-religious, anti-Jewish religious statements. So that's what's upset everyone. Why can't the authorities intervene?
So the police have conducted their own investigations, and they say there's no grounds to be able to take legal action against the preachers. And as you say, because there's been a more general focus rather than getting specific, and so it doesn't necessarily fall under that incitement banner. Hey, what is in these anti-Jewish sermons that you have found to be most disturbing?
Well, one series of 3 sermons that was preached by a young radical preacher went through the story of the life of Muhammad in some detail, step by step, and explained how Muhammad waged war against Jews and killed them. And he said at one point, kill any Jew that comes into your power. So he recites the history of Muhammad's dealing with the Jews, and also brings to the attention of his audience various anti-Semitic statements in the Quran, that Jews are warmongering, that they're cowardly, that they're treacherous, and they kind of a source of evil. So those statements all taken together, and especially being grounded in the life of Muhammad and in the authority of the Quran, he's sort of saying, if you're genuinely a true Muslim and you believe the Quran and you believe that Muhammad's the best example, then you are bound by your religion to have all these extremely negative attitudes towards Jews. And the problem is that people that have that worldview, that anti-Jewish worldview, they are, of course, in the long term more likely to commit acts of violence. And so that's an assault on our it's an assault on the idea that everyone is fundamentally equal, and it's an assault on the principle, which I think is important in Australian society, that people should not be targeted based on their racial or religious attributes. People can be criticised for what they believe or what they do, but to stigmatise a whole class of people, assuming, for example, that all Jews are evil or all Jews are warmongering, this is completely contrary to what we would accept in our culture. Now, there's quite a high bar with the law. But one thing that attracted my attention recently was a sermon that was delivered on the 9th of February in Sydney by a very senior member of the Muslim imams community in Australia. And what really struck me about that is that he rehearses some of these anti-Semitic ideas, and then he says, in fact, all infidels have enmity towards Islam and Muslims. All infidels are the enemy. And then he says that jihad is the only way to deal with infidels. And he mentions Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, even atheists as well. So basically what that is saying is that, and he's very explicit that when he says jihad, he means jihad of conquest. It means military jihad. There's no solution other than jihad, which is military conquest, violence really, for the sake of Allah, of the problem of infidels in general. So what he's saying is that, yes, we need to deal with the Jews, but it's not just the Jews, it's Christians and everybody else as well. So, I mean, that's about as close as you can get, I think, to an explicit statement like, go and attack these people, saying that the only way to deal with non-Muslims is through jihad and through conquest. So that, I thought that should have been considered to have reached the rather high bar of New South Wales criminal legislation. I think that was a point at which the police could have taken action. This particular imam is a senior person. He's a member of the of the Imams Council Fatwa Committee, which is a group of highly expert imams who are empowered to make rulings to guide other Muslims. So he's not. Some of the people who preached in November and October, November, December, I would call them young radicals. But this particular sermon in February was by a senior, well-established member of the and respected member of the Muslim community. So I think that makes it all the more significant.
Very, very significant, because this would have been the thought that perhaps most listeners might have had. This might be just some young radicals who have an opportunity on their platform to say these things. But as you reflect, this is coming from someone high up in the Muslim community here in Australia. Give us a little insight here for a moment, because there's division within Islam. There's the Sunnis and the Shias, and they typically don't like each other. Which group in Australia is the one that's got these sorts of agitations going? And any thoughts from you here?
In Australia, it's been Sunni Muslims that have been preaching these sermons, not Shia Muslims. I think the Shia presence is smaller, and some of the Shia, the Shia immigrants are more like the Iranian Shia immigrants, asylum seekers tend to be more secular anyway. But no, these are definitely Sunni groups. There are a number of different Sunni groups. There's two separate imams councils, in Australia, so they're not all in agreement with each other. And certainly some would be more moderate. Not everyone would preach a sermon like the one in February. There is a diversity of approaches, and also there's a diversity of sensitivities. So some of the imams who would have been raised in Australia, perhaps, and are more attuned to Australian culture, would be, I'm sure, reluctant to preach in that way, even if they did believe those sorts of statements. So there's variation between the imams, and within the Sunni community there are different strands as well. There's some more traditionalist Muslims, and there's Salafi Muslims who are quite explicit about going back to the source. There's different ethnicities as well, coming from many different cultures and backgrounds. So it's not just a one size fits all.
And Mark, for our listeners today, and while we're talking about a rising anti-Semitism here in Australia, and our thoughts clearly go to the Jewish people and the challenges that they are having with rising anti-Semitism around the world, you did say, but everyone who is considered an infidel is also in the sights of those who are on the more radical Islamic side, and you did say that it's Christians too who are grouped in there. How do we as Christians think of what is happening so far as the rising anti-Semitism and the thought that Christians are considered to be people of the book? You've got the Old Testament, the New Testament, the revelation of God to the Jewish people and to the Christians. Where do we see ourselves in that rise?
That's a good question. I think in general, Christians have not been paying that much attention to anti-Christian sentiments expressed by more radical Muslim preachers. So these sentiments have been out there for a very long time. And I mean, I've been tracing the anti-Jewish expressions in the Muslim community for more than 20 years. This is not just a recent development, and it goes back to the Quran and the life of Muhammad. Like, anti-Semitism is hardwired into the Quran. But what's important is that from an Islamic theological perspective, infidels in general are stigmatized. So non-believers in Islam in general are stigmatized. And among those, the worst statements are directed towards the Jews and also hypocrites. These are people who have perhaps been Muslims and left Islam, but Christians are also included in that category. There's a saying in the Middle East, an Arabic saying, proverb, that says, Saturday comes before Sunday. So that is, we'll deal with the Jews first and Christians later. So I think it's important for Christians to understand that the driver for anti-Semitism shares also a lot with the driver for anti-Christian sentiment, and that the preachers who declare that Jews are the problem sometimes also declaring that all non-Muslims are the problem. That was the case with Imam Abdul Salam Zood's sermon in February, that he was basically saying, we need to use jihad for all infidels. And so Christians should be aware of that, and they should be aware that when there's a quite aggressive anti-Jewish sentiments coming out of the Muslim community, that in the longer term, Christians will be subject to similar criticism and spiritual attacks as well. I think it's true also that the struggle, for example, the West is having with radical Islam. In that struggle, Israel is a kind of first line of defense. That is, sometimes people have said that if only Israel didn't exist, the Middle East would be peaceful. But that's not the case. If Israel was destroyed, the jihadis would continue their global campaign. London and Washington and Sydney would still be in the sights of these radicals, because and the Palestinians, preachers have made this very clear, their long-term goal is not just the liberation, as they would call it, of Palestine, but also the re-establishment of the caliphate, the Islamization of the world. So it's important to understand this is not just about Gaza. It's a much, much deeper problem. And that's what the preacher was saying in February. This is really about dealing with infidels, and Islam's destiny, he said, is to rule over all other religions, and the way to achieve that is through military jihad. And that's pretty implacable, and we need to pay attention to that. We need to work out ways of countering that message.
Mark, let me ask you, New South Wales and the laws that we were talking about a little earlier in our introductory segment, there's a review that's going on right now. What's your latest on what's happening with the review of laws?
Yeah, this is the review of Section 93Z of the New South Wales Crimes Act, and the review is with the view to lowering the bar, to make it easier to convict people of incitement. This was the problem that the police were facing. They felt the law wasn't fit for purpose. So they'll need to be able to distinguish between, criticism of another religion versus incitement of hatred and violence towards people of that religion. That's not that easy. I do worry a bit, because I don't think courts are the best place to make rulings on what is legitimate religious belief. But we're kind of forced into a situation where we need to at least speak against incitement. I think a call for military jihad against non-believers, like the one that was issued in February in Lakemba Mosque by the Imam, that should be illegal in Australia. The risk is that conversations like the ones that we're having now could become targeted by such laws. So we don't want to suppress open discussion of issues like security and differences between religions, but we need to say, it's illegal to call for violent jihad against infidels. So whether our secular lawmakers will be able to figure that out in a good way, I'm somewhat skeptical and concerned about that process.
You've been writing about an exemption that's provided for any act done reasonably in good faith for religious discussion or instruction purposes. This comes down to just how far is too far, and a high bar rather than a lower bar. This is the sort of thing where you would hope that New South Wales lawmakers might be considering the change?
Yes, so that exemption is in the civil provisions, where the people that have been vilified need to make a complaint. What the New South Wales is considering at the moment is tightening up the criminal provisions in the Crimes Act. Now, there is no exemption for teaching religions in that, and I don't think they'll be introducing one. So what they need to do is focus on incitement to violence that's not just specific, like go and attack this particular person, but is generic as well. Like we have the right to, anyone who doesn't rule by Islam should be killed. Those sorts of statements need to be able to be prosecuted in the courts, and And that's the challenge. So there will not be religious exemptions for those criminal provisions, I'm sure.
Let me ask you about definitions, because, what incitement is defined as maybe where the New South Wales lawmakers might be looking. But for us, in our understanding of what's going on, understanding what incitement is and understanding what jihad is, because most of us perhaps will understand that, jihad is about struggle and those sorts of things. You said a little earlier in our conversation that there's a taking up arms element of that jihad as well. What are your thoughts here around definitions and how Christians might understand what is going on in Islam when these things happen, and how we might be thinking about where Christians stand?
Well, just to touch on the first question you mentioned, incitement means stirring up negative feelings against somebody. And it's a tricky concept because it might be very legitimate to incite negative feelings. Like if I describe what the Nazis did in the Holocaust, you should feel bad feelings about the Nazis. That's incitement, but it's not unlawful incitement. So incitement needs exemptions because there are contexts where it's reasonable. That is, the incitement comes from the actual material or the truth of what people have done or said, and the problem is getting the balance. So that's why they have exemptions. Jihad, now this is a noun based on the verb jahada, which means to strive, and technically it could mean striving, but in fact in Islamic law, the Islamic jurisprudence, the word jihad refers to fighting against non-believers to extend Islam and open up the world to Islam. For example, if you were to pick up a Sharia textbook and open the table of contents, you'd find that there's a section that deals with jihad, and it's not about personal struggle or about kind of self-improvement. It's all about warfare. Or if you were to open up a volume of Muhammad's sayings, his traditions, the hadiths as they're called, you will find a book of jihad, Kitab al-Jihad, that is a book of jihad, and it's all about warfare. None of it is about self-improvement. So as a technical term in Islamic law, jihad means battle. It can mean the battle of a nation, so military campaigns by a nation. It could mean battle by a band. It could be an individual act of jihad as well, rising up in order to fight against infidels. But there's absolutely no doubt that jihad means warfare against non-believers in the core part of Islamic sciences. And the attempt to say that it's not military, that it has other meanings, I mean, that's technically true, but it's a misleading statement. It means military engagement, as the Imam said in February the 9th. He got it right.
So has that word jihad been used from the pulpits in mosques to what we might be saying here, incite followers to jihad? Is jihad a word that's commonly used in sermons?
I haven't surveyed enough Islamic sermons to be able to answer that, but I know that it is used and has been used in some messages, and like the one in February. So it's absolutely. It's a mainstream Islamic concept. It's not something that the Muslim community would resile from. Like, it's mostly conservative Muslims are proud of Islam's history of conquest. It's one of the glories of Islam that the jihad was successful, and that Islam was spread to the world through conquest. So this is not something Muslims in general are embarrassed about. The issue becomes complicated when you say, should there be jihad here? Is that legitimate? And that then it becomes, Muslims vary on how they'd respond to that. I want to say a great many Muslims, really dislike all these teachings about violence and incitement to violence. They would be appalled at the sermon that the Imam gave in February and the others. So that's important to understand. We shouldn't stigmatise a whole class of people just because of the atrocious statements of a few.
Before we go any further, Mark, why don't we take a call from a listener? Vince is in Brisbane. Hello, Vince. Welcome along.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. How are you?
Very good, Vince. What are your thoughts?
Look, believe it or not, a couple of times I've got involved in arguments with anti-Semites over October 7th and the whole Jewish question in general. And one of the things they refer to is Jews that actually are, that are against Israel, that they are there, protesting against Israel. I think they're referring to a group called JVP, Jews for Peace. They are actually, I think, funded by George Soros, and I think they're definitely Marxist linked. So I can see the nefarious agenda. George Soros, too, by the way, he's only at most a nominal Jew. He's definitely anti-Israel. He's funded a lot of these far left groups, stirring up trouble. And when I confront anti-Semites with that fact, actually they get very uncomfortable hearing that, because they're anti-Soros themselves. But when I come up and say, hey, wait a minute, Soros is funding these protests against Israel. So I just like, in a nutshell, what my question being to Mark, have you heard this using the argument that, there's plenty of Jews, protesting against Israel, so that makes these protests okay? That's essentially my question.
Vince, in fact, we might have all seen news reports of people protesting on the streets of Israel against their own government. And
That's right.
Your thoughts here, Mark, for Vince?
Well, I think you get people adopting a variety of views on almost any issue. The numbers of Jews that are anti-Israel is, I'd say, small and has declined. That October 7th actually caused a lot of them to wake up, and some people shifted completely in their worldview, but they're a small minority. It doesn't prove anything. Like, it's not an argument for truth, the fact that someone agrees with you. Oh, by the way, this person agrees with me. That's not an argument. It's not a rational argument. It's just emotional manipulation, really. It's not convincing, and I'd call it out. I'll say that doesn't prove anything. It's just you're just saying that there's some Jews that are misguided as well, but it doesn't prove the truth of their cause.
Mark, the other part of Vince's question was around, who's financing the public protest movement. The name George Soros comes to mind as someone who funds a lot of left-wing causes. Any thoughts here for who drives the protest movements and might be driving a rise in anti-Semitism?
I haven't studied that personally, so I don't think I'm qualified to comment on it. I do observe that the outbreak of these protests around the world after October the 7th seemed coordinated. It seemed like people were ready for this. In fact, people began protesting even before the Israelis had begun their military response. And it suggests to me that there's the Islamic, more radical end of the Islamic communities in the West have been aligning themselves and liaising with people more on the hard left for quite some time, and there's been a partnership developed, and I think a decision in some sense a strategic decision was made to make this a global issue, and that's why there's been this simultaneous outbreak of demonstrations. So I think there is coordination, but I don't know who is coordinating it or how that's happening.
I've still got Vince on the line. Vince, you're clearly very courageous and happy to get into a conversation, an engaging conversation. What sort of experiences have you had? Have they been level-headed, comfortable conversations, or have they been heated arguments? How do you describe getting into a conversation?
Neil, look, I would describe them as quite heated. One argument I got into, this woman, she fervently believes, for example, that all Jews control the world. And all Jews are bankers, but also, strangely, think all Jews are Bolsheviks, right? Going back to the time like Leon Trotsky, things like this, the Khazarian origin of Jews, things like that. They have been heated.
No doubt there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, interesting terminology to be talking about in this sense, but so much misinformation about Jewish people. And I know we've had a conversation around these sorts of things before too, Mark Durie, about what people truly believe about Israel and where they're finding their source of facts. Any thoughts here for something further as Vince is talking about his engagement?
Yeah, I do meet Christians who think that you have this inflated view of the power of Jews in the world. They believe they control the media and control governments and they control the financial systems. These are Western European anti-Semitic sentiments. They haven't arisen in the Islamic world. Islam has its own anti-Semitic characteristics, like that Jews are treacherous and kind of inherently evil and hate Islam. So these two streams, Western sort of culturally Christian anti-Semitism and Islamic anti-Semitism, are flowing together at the present time. So you've got like two bushfires joining together, and that's deeply troubling. So people have quite outrageous and illogical, sort of in a way insane views about the power of Jews in the world, and it's extraordinary, really, and very, very disturbing, because this is what one of the factors that drove the Holocaust was these sorts of lies.
Vince in Brisbane, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open, 1800 316 316. You might have a question for our special guest today, who is a Christian expert in Islam. Let me bring you back to the review of some laws in New South Wales, Mark, and exemptions, and the way that incitement might be defined, the sorts of things that people who are in the public eye, but also someone like Vince who's on the street, or even in a conversation that we might be having on the radio like this, the way we might conduct a conversation about a rising anti-Semitism. How do these sorts of things fit into the sorts of laws that might be under review in New South Wales?
Yeah, so the law that's being reviewed in New South Wales is the criminal provisions, and I think they need to be able to say, preaching violence in general could be incitement to violence, even if there's no specific call for violence. So they need to lower the bar there. The other kind of law we have are the civil provisions, and maybe I could just offer a few comments on those. So the civil provisions say that you can't incite hatred based on someone's religious or racial characteristics. Now, they usually have a series of words like hatred, contempt, ridicule. The difficulty with those laws is that there are some things that you would genuinely and reasonably say about someone that could incite bad feelings. So, for example, in my article on Abdul Salam Zood's sermon from February, I describe what he said about jihad, that jihad is the only way to deal with non-Muslims, including Christians, by the way. Now, if someone reads that, they might feel quite negative feelings towards the imam. That is, they might think that's a despicable and wrong thing to say, and I have contempt for that view. That's not an unreasonable response to that, to being exposed to that. So you could say that in writing that way, I have potentially incited negative feelings in people towards the imam, and that is actually what incitement is. But it would be unreasonable not to have exemptions, and the exemptions allow you to do things that could incite negative feelings if you're doing them reasonably and in good faith for a series of possible purposes, such as art, religion, politics. So in this particular case, although a reader of my article might be incited to strong negative feelings about the imam or about Islam, I have written it, I think, for a reasonable and legitimate purpose, which is to bring to light these expressions of religious hatred so that people can understand what's being said, and in order to encourage appropriate government policy to deal with these issues. So then the question then is, when you're writing or speaking about, say, Islam or Christianity or any ideology, or even a nation such as America or Israel, are you speaking in a way that is reasonable and in good faith? That is, reasonable could mean, have you done reasonable fact checking? Do you have a reasonable basis for saying that the things you've said are true? For example, in writing in this article, I have carefully checked the text and made sure that what I wrote was accurate to what he said. Are you stigmatizing a whole group of people based on the behavior of one? That would be unreasonable and not in good faith. So if, for example, you're giving a Christian sermon in a church and you mention Islam and you are critical of Muhammad, for example, in that sermon, you need to be able to show that it was appropriate to the sermon topic and to the purpose of the message to mention that material, and it was relevant. You're not just gratuitously kind of pulling in negative comments. For example, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool Protestant and you preach a sermon and you're always dragging in kind of critical comments about the Catholic Church at every opportunity, justified or not, then that's not reasonable and good faith. But if you were to give a sermon specifically on, say, a particular Catholic doctrine, such as the ascension of Mary into heaven, or her eternal virginity, if you were to mention that and you say, well, I'm going to preach about that today because this is an important issue, and you stuck to that topic, that would be reasonably in good faith. So one of the things I think that we need to be careful of is that when we're talking about difficult and sensitive topics that could stir up strong feelings, that we are appropriate, that we stick to topic, we check our facts, and and that we're thorough in what we do. So that's important for people to understand.
We might all be very thrilled that you've been checking your facts, Mark Durie, because there might be a few of us saying, Mark Durie says, and we might be quoting you. Hey, we're taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's take some more, some questions for our guest today. Chris is in Melbourne. Hey, Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Neil and Mark. Yeah, we know that, it all started off with this spirit of jealousy and rejection, Isaac and Ishmael. And then,
Chris, you're breaking up a little bit there. I just try that one more time.
Is that all right? Can you hear me now?
Breaking up a little bit. Just say what you need to say, and hopefully we'll catch it.
Originally it's all about the Muslim, the spirit of jealousy and rejection of Isaac and Ishmael. But that was carried on throughout, and then the Muslim Brotherhood, went to Hitler because of still believe, that the Jews wanted them.
Chris, look, I don't think that one's difficult. I mean, can you catch any of that at all from your end, Mark?
Yes. Chris was asking about the spirit of rejection, and he traces it back to the story of Isaac and Ishmael. So Christians for 2,000 years have said that, or not 2,000 years, but for 1,400 years, since Islam arose, had tried to link Ishmael to Islam and Isaac to Judaism and Christianity. But I don't think that's correct. Like, I don't think Ishmael was the father of the Arabs. That's what people have said for 2,000 years. Josephus said that Ishmael was the father of the Arabs, but I don't think that's true. Actually, Arabs don't actually teach that. There are traditions around the time of Muhammad that said that some of the Muslim tribes, some of the Arab tribes descended from Ishmael. But I actually don't see the Ishmael story as the key to understanding this conflict. I think there is rejection. Chris was right in that, but the rejection was something that Muhammad experienced in his own life, and his response to that rejection included the rejection of others, and that does drive and shape Islam. One of the most moving things that I've done in my life, I think, was to deeply study Muhammad's experiences of rejection and how he responded, and comparing that to how Jesus responded to rejection and persecution, and the gentleness of Christ and his determination to show love and a servant heart in all his circumstances, even to crucifixion, is such a complete contrast with the life of Muhammad. So that's Chris is right. Rejection is a big issue, but it's not the Ishmael Isaac type rejection. It's more what happened in Muhammad's life.
Okay, thank you so much to Chris in Melbourne, taking calls 1800 316 316. Let's take another call. Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Hey Sue, welcome.
Hello, Neil, and hello, Mark. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. As a committed follower of Jesus, I engaged with a number of Muslims in Shepparton and Swan Hill, and I was able to purchase a copy of the Quran, so I studied it, and I see clearly where in the Surah 4 and Surah 9 speaks of Jesus, the Messiah, there's this challenge that we now have where we can engage with Muslims as followers of Jesus because Jesus is their prophet, or one of their main prophets.
You're making a good point there, Sue. Let's get a quick response here from Mark around Jesus and his presence in the Quran. Some debate over whether the Jesus of the Quran is the same as the Jesus of the New Testament. Thoughts here for Sue?
I think it's a great opportunity to connect with Muslims and your Muslim neighbours by speaking about Jesus and to approach them as indeed followers of Jesus, as Sue said, because Islam has a high regard for Jesus. The problem is that the Quran doesn't really understand Jesus, and some of the things it says about Jesus are not true. And also, Jesus is much more than a Muslim prophet. He's the Messiah, the Son of God. And Islam explicitly rejects that and says that it's a terrible thing to say. So you've got a deep disagreement about who Jesus is, but nevertheless, to approach Muslims and say, look, I follow Jesus, and let's talk about Jesus, or you tell me about Muhammad, I'll tell you about Jesus. That's a good conversation to have, and it's a good bridge to use. But it is a bit problematic because of the Jesus of the Gospels is very different from the Jesus of the Quran.
Sue in Kingston, thank you so much for your call. Let's squeeze in one more. Richard is in Austinville. Hello, Richard. Welcome along.
G'day, guys. I just had two questions for you. To give a bit of context for the first one, I was in Sydney on holidays at Christmas in 2013. And I got into a taxi with a Lebanese Muslim taxi driver, and it was the same year that the ex-Australian soldier got captured by the Islamic terrorist group in the Philippines. Anyway, we got to having a conversation about different things about the Bible and the Quran and stuff, and he started saying things like they wouldn't hesitate to kill Israeli soldiers or whatever, so because he's Lebanese Muslim. Do they have a cultural, sort of like a cultural set or something where it's kind of ingrained in them from like a really young age to hate Jews and to hate anybody that's not Muslim per se?
Richard, I'll keep you at this one question, but a response here from Mark.
It's a great question. I think Muslims vary a lot in how they think about non-Muslims. So some would regard them as equal and they have no problem with non-Muslim friends and everything. But there'd be others that would see them as alien and basically opposed to Islam and wrong. And the Quran does use a term for non-Muslims, kafir, which implies deception and kind of moral failure as well as disbelief. So inherent in Islam's teaching about non-Muslims is that they are bad people, basically, and that they're not the right people. There's a statement in the Quran that says that Muslims should rule. Muslims are the best people that have been raised up, and they should command what's right and forbid what's wrong. So there is, I think, built into the heart of Islam, a stigmatizing of non-Muslims, and attributing to them quite negative characteristics. So yes, that is part of Islam. You mentioned starting off about killing an Israeli. I think Islam has very different rules of war from the Geneva Convention. So killing soldiers that you take in war is quite acceptable to the Islamic rules of war. So prisoners of war, their life is not protected in Islamic rules of war. So there's a whole different worldview there about warfare that influences people.
Richard, I'll keep you at that one question, but I want to thank you so much for your call. Time is running short, and really drawing some loose ends together, perhaps finishing, Mark, with some thoughts about ordinary Aussies being swept up into this anti-Semitic flow, even Christians being caught up into that anti-Semitic flow. Any thoughts here around how we might be thinking about moving forward and making sense of the thoughts that you're hearing from, your news sources or social media? What are your thoughts here for listeners and moving forward from here?
I think it's important to reject the traditional kind of Western anti-Semitic tropes. That is the idea that Jews control the world and they are supremely powerful and control the media. That sort of way of thinking. If you have that view, I'd suggest you go and have a good hard look at yourself, because it's not true, and it's deeply ingrained in our culture. It's a long-term lie that's partnering with all this recent stuff. I think there's some deceptions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that are influential. The claim that the Israelis are executing a genocide is so easily disprovable and quite false. So if you believe that, again, I'd say you're in trouble, because that's certainly not the case. And so, be careful about being swept up into beliefs that are not true and not sustainable. Seek the truth. I think the other thing I'd say is exercise compassion for everyone involved in the Middle Eastern conflict. Don't reserve your compassion just for one side. I feel deep sorrow for the Palestinian casualties and their families. I'm grieved that Hamas has put them in this position. I feel sorrow too for the Israelis who've lost lives and loved ones in this conflict. So we should have compassion for all people, not just for one group of people.
As always, Mark Durie, wonderful insights and a tremendous view as to what's going on in Australia, the things that are ahead of us and the challenges that lie ahead, and the encouragement to get things right and not to believe everything you hear, but to be able to get things right and to be able to, I guess, have a biblical view too of where Christians will stand on these issues. You've written a whole lot of books on issues around Islam. One book called The Quran and its Biblical Reflexes. You might like to look at another one called The Third Choice, an award-winning book. Another book called Which God? Another one called Liberty in the Captives. And your latest book was not to do anything with Islam, but really double-minded. It was called Exploring the Sexual Revolution in Australia and the Changing Sexual Ethics on Australian Christians. So for listeners, you might want to connect with some of those books at markdurie.com. Durie, spelled D-U-R-I-E, markdurie.com. Mark, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for great insights again today on 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.